It is week 3, and we are on to climate change and geoengineering, climate ethics in general. Um, for some reason, when I hit record, the title disappears from the slide. This is Walter Sinnot Armstrong's article. It's not my fault. Um, he's arguing that individuals, as opposed to the governments, can't be held responsible for actions that may or may not contribute to climate change. All right, so just to sort of frame the question, so I guess I can assume that everyone knows what climate change is, and we're assuming for the purposes of this course and for the purposes of this article that it is real, um, right? Emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are increasing, right? The average temperature, and this is having bad effects. Um, it's going to raise sea levels, create more wildfires, so on. We're already seeing the effects. It's having unpredictable effects on things like hurricanes and things like that. So it's going to cause suffering for a lot of people, probably death for a lot of people. Uh, and he is assuming here that governments do have an obligation to work to stop climate change. The question is, what responsibility do you and I, as just individual citizens, have? So he starts with 8 assumptions, right? Again, and I think I mentioned before, this is often a useful device. In your paper, you don't have room to argue for everything, right? You're probably arguing for some premise that's kind of deep in an argument. So you can set up and say, look, I'm assuming these things from the outset, and then the thing I want to argue for is something that may or may not follow from those assumptions, right? So here are Sinnot Armstrong's 8 assumptions that he doesn't argue for and just says here, this is our starting point. Number 1, global warming has begun and will likely increase in coming years. 2, human activity, mainly the use of fossil fuels, is responsible for a significant amount of this global warming. Global warming is going to cause serious problems due to sea levels rising, drought, heat waves, and so on. Millions of people will probably be displaced or die. Large sections of coastline are now becoming uninhabitable, right? So people are going to have to move. Um, we're having pervasive droughts. Um, Number 4, the poor are going to be disproportionately hurt by global warming. They're just going to have fewer resources to deal with this stuff, to pick up and move, right? Or to deal with food scarcity, increases in food prices, and so on. These are the second 4 of the 8 assumptions. So 5, governments, particularly the biggest and richest, can make a difference by imposing limits on fossil fuel use, engaging in reforestation, carbon sequestration. So there are things we can do, right? Or at least governments can do, right? Because they have the resources to make this stuff happen. 6, we can slow global warming, but we cannot stop it at this point. So we're going to have to do some large scale projects if we want to save these areas of coastline where people live, where we have to build seawalls. Those ones that can't be saved, we will have to relocate people. Not everyone can afford to just abandon their house and build a new one. 7, the things we need to do to mitigate the effects of global warming are costly. There are some sort of win-win sorts of plans where it doesn't actually cost a lot of money and we get a good effect. But at least over the near term, what we need to do is reduce fossil fuel use, reduce carbon emissions, and that is going to slow down the economy in the near term. And 8, despite this cost, governments do have a moral obligation to undertake these steps, particularly the US, right? We're probably the richest or the country most capable of helping, and we also are responsible for a big share of the emissions. So again, those are just things he's assuming to be the case. Um, but what doesn't follow from those is that there's any obligation for an individual, right? So just because the government has an obligation to do these things doesn't mean that I, as a citizen of the country, um, has any particular obligation. So he used an example of a bridge, right? So say a bridge needs to be fixed. There's big cracks. There's multiple cracks in it, right? And say the government doesn't fix it, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that I, as the citizen, are obliged to fix it. And that lack of obligation obtains even if I drive over it every day, right? Even if the obligation isn't to fill in merely one crack, right? Even if every citizen who drove over it, if they filled in one crack, it would be fixed. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean that any of us have that obligation, right? The idea is that no, this is the government's job. Certain things are the job of the government, right? Not individual citizens. Now, if you accept that sort of analogy, then you might accept, okay, fine. So just because the government is obliged to do something doesn't necessarily imply that individual citizens of that country have any particular obligation. But sometimes that might be the case. So another analogy, right? If the government fails to fund schools enough to teach my child to read, you might argue that I then have the obligation to step in and do so, right? So which is the case of climate change like? Is it like the bridge, right? Or is it like teaching your child to read? This is the subject of the essay, and this is the question that he wants to explore. There are lots of things I could do to help, right, with climate change. I could protest the government's policies. I could run for office. I can vote for particular candidates. I can be very careful, right, in what I consume, what I purchase as a consumer. So he wants to pick just one thing to focus on, right, to be sort of the vehicle for this argument. And he's going to talk about wasteful driving, right? So the emissions from cars do contribute to global warming. And he concedes that sometimes you have to drive in order to make money and survive, right? So he's not considering the possibility that you might be morally obligated to never drive a car and just lose your job over it. But he does note that we do sometimes drive when we don't strictly have to, right? So he says, let's focus on those cases and see. It seems like something you could conceivably give up, right? It wouldn't be disastrous to give up driving when you don't need to. So he wants to see if, again, and he's setting up, right, sort of the easiest case for his opponent, right? Here's something you could easily give up, right? So the question is, are you morally obligated to? So the example he wants to use is suppose that I want to go through a drive through the mountains on a Sunday afternoon just for pleasure. Let's say I want to drive a big gas-guzzling SUV because it gives me pleasure to feel the powerful engine around those curves, right? Driving a Prius just is not going to cut it, right? It's not going to be as fun for me. And the point of this is it's just pure fun. And rather than sort of focus on whether it's moral to buy a gas-guzzling SUV, let's suppose I borrow it from a friend, right? And let's also ignore the possibility of causing an accident or something like that. So what he wants to focus on is just this pure issue of am I allowed to burn some gas, contribute some extra emissions just because it's fun, right? Is that morally wrong? So Sinnot Armstrong admits that there is sort of an inclination. You might have the intuition that, yeah, that is wrong, right? It's sort of wasteful. You don't need it. But he says that I don't particularly think that that's good evidence, right? Just because you have some kind of gut feeling about that, other people have different gut feelings. There's all sorts of like cultural and personal baggage that might shape those gut feelings, those intuitions that you have. So that's sort of a whole hornet's nest of problems, right? And he wants to sort of avoid that area altogether. And instead, his argumentative strategy is going to say, let's see if there are any sort of widely accepted general moral principles that would entail that wasteful driving is wrong, right? And this is going to be the entire sort of like argumentative structure of his essay. Is he go one by one? Here's a moral principle. Here's another one. Here's another one. And he's going to argue that none of them entail that your Sunday drive of an SUV is morally wrong, right? And if he's exhausted all the plausible moral principles, that seems like strong evidence that it's not wrong. All right, so the first sort of most obvious one is the harm principle. Uh, we have a moral obligation not to perform any actions that cause harm to others. Again, ceteris paribus, right? If I have to harm you in order to save your life, right? If I have to grab your arm to keep you from falling off a bridge and it breaks your wrist, um, obviously that's should be morally permissible. But in general, right? All things considered, don't harm people. So the problem with applying this principle to the case of right the gas guzzler is that one individual act of driving just doesn't cause any harm on its own. You only get the harm when millions of people and corporations and factories are creating emissions for like 100 years, right? Um, and even if I chose not to drive, it wouldn't help. Global warming would still happen, right? So my own particular action of the Sunday drive is neither necessary, right, to cause any harm, nor is it sufficient to cause any harm. Now, you might respond, right? You might point out that you might say the same thing of me pushing a car and its passenger off a cliff with the help of 5 different people, right? So if is that clearly that must be morally wrong, right? So what's the difference, right? Or is there a difference? Sinnot Armstrong wants to say yes, there is a difference, right? So um, you pushing along with 5 people at someone's car with them in it off a cliff is different in 2 respects from the SUV from the Sunday driving example. First, you're intending to harm someone, and secondly, the action is unusual, right? So the intention thing is clear enough, right? Um, Driving my SUV, my intention is not to cause global warming and hurt people. My intention is to have some harmless fun. Uh, but the unusualness needs a little clarification. So, what does it mean that it's unusual to push someone off a cliff? Uh, Usual factors typically don't get cited in causal explanations for things, right? In particular, causal explanations for harms. So if you ask what caused a fire, you might talk about an electrical short, right? Or someone lighting a curtain with a match. The reason you cite those factors is because those are unusual. They don't happen all the time. What you wouldn't say is, oh, what caused the fire? Oh, oxygen, right? I mean, oxygen is a necessary condition, but it's just always present, right? It's a usual factor, so we don't usually count those as like the relevant causal factors. Same thing in moral cases. We don't usually blame people or think that they're a cause of some harm if whatever they were doing was no worse than most people were doing, if it's kind of a usual thing. It's not unusual to go for a drive on a Sunday. Uh, and you don't intend to do any harm by doing it. So, it's neither necessary or sufficient for harm. So it doesn't satisfy the harm principle, and it's a different sort of thing than pushing a car off a cliff with a group of people. And Senator Armstrong says it's not even analogous to other big problems like famine. Now, in the case of a famine in some part of the world, it's true that your own little donation could help a particular person. It can't prevent the mass starvation, right? All of the harms, but it can prevent one little piece of harm, right? You could help one person get water or help them with a place to live or a place to stay for a while, even with maybe $100. But skipping my Sunday drive doesn't even seem to help a single person, right? Global warming is going to happen whether I do it or not. All the same people are going to be displaced. Now, you might try to make a distinction between global warming and climate change, right? So global warming is the rise in the temperature, and then climate change is all the disastrous things that result from that, right? So you might say, well, your Sunday drive does raise the temperature of the globe a tiny, tiny fraction of a degree. Actually, it might be hard to even say that, right? But saying that it does, right? Saying that you could somehow measure that, or in principle that there is some tiny effect from a single drive, that alone doesn't harm people, right? It's not the global warming that harms the people, it's the climate change, right? And your drive isn't going to cause sea levels to rise or a drought. And the problem is not that you are causing a harm, but it's just far in the future or that it's imperceptibly small. what Sinnot Armstrong is arguing is that there's literally no harm. You can't connect that drive to any harmful effect on any individual person or group of people. Okay, so much for the harm principle. On to some more principles. Now, if you think that Sinnot Armstrong has not sufficiently refuted that argument, that the harm principle entails that you shouldn't drive your car, then you could write an essay on that, right? But he's moving on. He thinks he's done the job. So he says, maybe my drive leads to other actions that are harmful. For example, maybe it forms a habit in me, and so I start driving every weekend, maybe every day, right? And somehow my aggregate emissions over years causes harm. He thinks that that's pretty doubtful too, right? It takes millions of people a lot of time to get us into this situation. So even one person driving every Sunday or every day is unlikely to make a difference. Or maybe I post my drive on TikTok and all of a sudden wasteful driving becomes a viral craze and all of a sudden millions of people are copying me, right? Well, conceivably that could cause a harm, right? That would be enough. So in that case, that would be an indirect harm, right? So my drive inspires millions of people to do the same thing, and now some harm happens indirectly. So here's a formulation of the indirect harm principle. We have a moral obligation not to perform an act that causes harm to others indirectly by causing someone to carry out acts that cause. You're not necessarily causing the harm, but you are causing others to cause the harm. Okay, so does that work, right? Is that why you shouldn't drive your SUV? Senator Armstrong says, well, most of us are not that influential, right? It takes like kind of billions of people, decades to create climate change. And he doubts that you could have that sort of impact. Maybe some, right? Maybe there's people out there that could have that much impact. Right? Some people do sell. I think the Beatles have sold 1 billion records, right? So if Paul McCartney had told us all to drive our SUVs and we all copied him, would that count? Well, Senator Armstrong thinks also just the indirect harm principle on its own is not very convincing, right? So it seems to entail that if someone goes around doing bad stuff, but no one likes him particularly and wants to imitate him, then that would make the things he's doing not bad, less bad. And he just thinks that in general, it's implausible that your obligation to do the right thing should somehow depend on how many people want to copy you. All right, on to more principles. The contribution principle. Maybe I can't create climate change by my own actions, right? But maybe I make it worse. So let's consider the contribution principle. We have a moral obligation not to make problems worse, right? So there's a problem out there, and my driving an SUV makes it a little bit worse. Sinnot Armstrong says, well, actually, your drive doesn't even make climate change worse. It would be just as bad if you didn't drive, right? It has kind of whatever causal contribution it makes, it's not sufficient to make any difference, right? To make a harm or any sort of bad effect. This is because what does it mean to make it worse? Well, it means more people are hurt, or if the harm caused to people is worse, and it's just not. He doesn't think plausible to say that one person's driving meets that standard. All right, well, what about the gas principle, right? Maybe by contribute, in the contribution principle, we mean expel any amount of greenhouse gas. So here's the gas principle. We have a moral obligation not to expel greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, period. Well, that would definitely entail that my Sunday drive is moral. But the problem is that principle seems false, right? Carbon dioxide and water vapor are greenhouse gases, and those are necessary for plants to grow. And so in general, right, like every time I breathe or boil water, right, this creates a greenhouse gas. So the problem isn't with low quantities of these. Those are sort of necessary for life on Earth. The problem isn't with the harmless quantities. The problem is with the high quantities. But your drive is, as we've argued, a harmless quantity, right? So it doesn't seem to hold water. Well, sometimes we can be morally wrong to do something even if it doesn't end up causing any harm, right? Consider drunk driving, right? So maybe you drive drunk, you get from the bar to your house safely, you don't crash your car, you don't hurt anybody. Nonetheless, you might say that's wrong. Well, why is that wrong? Because of the risk principle, right? You might say we have a moral obligation not to increase the risk of harms to other people. So by driving drunk, even if you don't harm anybody, that particular time you have increased the probability that you harm somebody, right? That's fine. That's a plausible principle, and it seems to work for drunk driving. But the problem with the SUV is that the risk principle requires that there's at least the potential for harm, that you've increased the probability of someone being harmed. And as we've already argued, there doesn't seem to be any harm at all, right, from the single driving. So you have not increased the probability of any harm. So the risk principle doesn't apply. And if you insisted on applying it anyway, it would seem to then rule out breathing or boiling water again. And that seems a little too stringent, right? All right. Again, so this seems like a really long list of moral principles, and it is. But he's trying to make a very exhaustive argument, given his strategy, that pick any, right? Look at all. I've picked every possible plausible moral principle, and it still doesn't entail that doing anything wrong by driving on a Sunday, right? That's the idea. So we're going to go through a few more. The categorical imperative. So you might recall this from our very first lecture, right? This is associated with Kant and deontology. So the categorical imperative, again, is this universalizability principle. Kant says we have a moral obligation not to act on any maxim that we cannot will to be a universal law. So the idea is you want to do something. Well, what rule would you be following if you said it's okay to do that? Now, could you take that rule and make it universal, that everybody should follow it? And you'll recall, right, that the point of it is not that it's not a problem if the maxim, if everybody followed it, it would have bad consequences. That's not Kant's point. Kant's point is that morality, right, is derived from pure reason, and so the maxim is a problem if it ends up resulting in some sort of contradiction, right? You'll recall promising, right? If the rule I'm following is like I can break promises whenever I feel like, then if you wanted everybody to act like that, then it would sort of end up being like there's not even a such thing as promises, because nobody ever feels like they need to keep them. And it ends up in some sort of contradiction or incoherence or something like that. So if we understand it in that way, would you generate some sort of contradiction or incoherence if you followed some maxim that allowed you to drive your SUV? Well, what maxim would you be following? You might be saying, okay, the general rule that I'm following is it's okay to have harmless fun, right? Because we've already argued that it's harmless. Well, that doesn't seem to be a problem. We don't see any contradiction with that. So maybe there's a different way of describing it. What if the maxim is it's okay to expel greenhouse gases? Well, that would be bad. That would have bad consequences, right? If everybody obeyed that maxim, but it's not a problem for Kant, right? Because Kant says, no, I don't care about consequences. I care about whether this is going to generate some sort of contradiction. It wouldn't be a contradiction. It would just be a crappy world, right? So the categorical imperative doesn't seem to rule out your Sunday drive. Well, if you recall from the first lecture, there's more than one formulation of the categorical imperative. So while we're at it, let's try the second one. The second one says we have a moral obligation not to treat other people's as a means to our ends, right? We have to treat them as ends in themselves, sort of like respect for other people. Well, what does it mean to use somebody as a means? One popular way to interpret it is that to use somebody as a means is to harm them for the purposes of furthering your own sort of personal goals. But we've already argued that my drive doesn't harm anybody, and since Kant is so worried about your intentions, right, more than consequences, I'm also not intending to hurt anybody, right, by doing my drive. So in either formulation, the categorical imperative doesn't seem to forbid Sunday drive. Well, what about virtue ethics? Again, we discussed it in the very first lecture. This was the virtue ethics associated with Aristotle. It says, what's the right thing to do? Well, It's what a virtuous person should do, right? And we talked about some of the various virtues. They're listed along the side here: gentleness, bravery, modesty, temperance, and so on. Um, so we want to avoid, right, doing vicious things, right, things that exhibit vices, and we should want to do virtuous things. So if driving a gas guzzler is vicious, right, if it's a vice, or if it's something that no virtuous person would do, then maybe virtue ethics would rule out our Sunday drive. So is my drive vicious? Well, we typically call things vicious if they cause people harm or if they're exceptionally risky, right? So gambling, heavy drinking, or you might recall the example of courage, right, which was in the middle of the golden mean, right, between foolhardiness and cowardliness, right? So the problem with foolhardiness is it's exceptionally risky, right? Um, so is the drive vicious in that sense? Well, we've already argued it's not harmful and it's not a problem. It's not risky in the problematic sense. Now, some people might disagree, right? They might say, no, a virtuous person, right, as I understand virtuous people, would not do such a thing. They wouldn't do such a wasteful sort of whatever, however you want to characterize the driving the SUV. It's not something a virtuous person should do. Well, Sinnot Armstrong wants to say, to make that argument, you need to give me an account of why it's a vice, right? He's considered one. Is it harmful or risky? And he says no. So this is an interesting point, right? I think Sinnot Armstrong does want to leave open some room for the idea of like green virtues, right? These are the sort of things that you would want to cultivate. And it does seem to cohere with a virtue ethical account of right and wrong. But he seems to want to sort of carve these things out and give me an account of why it's a vice. You might want to think that that's one of the virtues of virtue theory, right? Is that it captures our intuitions and it's not super rigid about like setting out rules as to what makes something a virtue or a vice, right? It's a little bit more intuitive than that. So I don't know, maybe this is a paper topic. Maybe there's room from virtue ethics to argue against driving an SUV. All right, moving on. Those were all, so far we've considered sort of individual principles about what an individual should do and what makes them right or wrong. Now, Sinnot Armstrong wants to consider some collective principles. So one he considers is the ideal law principle. It says we have a moral obligation not to perform an action if it ought to be illegal. So Sinnot Armstrong has already said that fighting global warming is the government's job. One of the things the government conceivably would do is outlaw driving these fuel inefficient cars. So if you think, well, it should be illegal to drive these SUVs, then according to the ideal law principle, then we shouldn't drive them now, even if it's currently legal, right? We're morally obliged to abide by the ideal laws, not just the present laws. Well, is that a way to sort of make it immoral to drive this SUV? Well, Senator Armstrong says here's one problem with that line of argument. It's not clear that it should be illegal to drive a gas guzzler. That's going to be pretty hard to enforce and a pretty coercive, right? Is the government going to confiscate your car and junk it? Probably not, right? People would get pretty pissed about that. I think more likely the government would put some sort of gradual tax on new SUVs, right? Or tighter standards on newer cars. That's probably going to fly a little better with the general public. That's the ideal law would probably take that form, right? In which case, currently existing SUVs would be fair game to drive. And there are further problems with the illegal law principle, right? So it probably should be a law that taxes be raised to combat global warming, right? If it's going to be an expensive process and it's probably going to involve, right, some sort of tax hike, maybe even ones on, folks like you and me that aren't super rich. But suppose that were the case, would that mean, if that were in an ideal law, does that mean I'm now morally obligated to send a government check in advance, right, for this law that doesn't exist yet? And you think anybody else is going to do that, right, if they don't actually have to? If Senator Armstrong says no, right, it probably makes more sense to say you have some moral obligation to get the law passed, right, to vote for the people that would pass it or to work, in that way, rather than to just act as if the law were already real, right? He seems to think the illegal law principle just in general is probably ill-founded. There's some more informal group principles that you might consider. Um, so what about principles that might govern like a sorority or an orchestra, right? So these little groups that informally sort of make joint decisions, and you might think that they're responsible for the cumulative effect of their joint actions. So if your uh, fraternity, right, makes some sort of exclusionary rules as to who they'll admit, you might want to blame the fraternity and in some way the individual members as well for making those rules, right? Uh, that's plausible, but Sinnot Armstrong wants to say that the group of gas guzzlers isn't that sort of group, right? They don't plan together to set up rules, right? It's just sort of a more abstract sort of set of people that perform a certain action. Um, and collectively, yeah, that might make a difference to climate change, but it's hard to carve them out as a group in the relevant. Okay, well, what about this version of the group principle? We have a moral obligation not to perform an action if this action makes us a member of a group whose actions together cause harm, right? So this is a really informal group. It's saying if you do anything that sort of puts you in the set of people that do that thing, and the set of people that do that thing together cause a harm, um, then you shouldn't do that thing, right? Well, Senator Armstrong thinks even that principle is not going to work. First of all, it's kind of question begging in the current context. That's actually the very question we're asking, right? And so to sort of craft a moral principle that uh, makes that immoral is not exactly the way to argue. Um, but it also doesn't seem to translate well in general, right? So it would, if there's a bunch of people talking loudly in an airport, right? And they're so loud that it makes a bunch of people, it's possible that people could miss their flights because they can't hear the intercom, right? So there's going to be a harmful effect from this sort of informal group of people talking loudly. Uh, so would that mean that it is morally impermissible for me to say loudly, "Everybody, quiet down"? Right? No, that would seem to be helpful, right? That's not a bad thing to do. So there's sort of little sort of technical issues that seem to make that group principle not really work. All right, so we're winding down. We got a few more principles here. So here's some counterfactual principles. These are sort of consequentialist arguments. Uh, And you should, again, recall consequentialist arguments. They're arguments that say if something has bad consequences, then it's bad to do it. So we talked about the categorical imperative. We said, hey, Kant, the way he set it up, he doesn't care about the consequences. He's concerned about whether it has some sort of internal contradiction. But you could imagine a consequentialist version of the categorical imperative. Call it the general action principle, right? I have a moral obligation not to perform an act when it would be worse for everyone to perform an act of the same kind, right? So if everybody, again, followed that rule, there would be bad consequences. That's the idea. So if everyone drove a gas guzzler, global warming would get very bad, very fast. We'd run through our supply of fossil fuels. It'd be a bad scene. But the problem is that, I mean, that principle seems attractive, right, when it comes to gas guzzlers, but you probably wouldn't want to use it generally, right? So it wouldn't qualify as a good general moral principle. Uh, the principle doesn't seem to work on, for example, having children, right? It would be a bad idea if everyone decided not to have children, right? But that shouldn't oblige me to therefore have children, right? If my general principle is like I don't want to have kids, and you think if everybody right did that, that would be bad. Um, but it if the conclusion you come to is that like you must have children, that seems wrong, right? Something went wrong there. So Senator Armstrong says, yeah, you could sort of get around that particular problem by recrafting your principle, right? So let's call it the general permission principle. I have a moral obligation not to perform an act whenever it would be worse for everyone to be permitted to perform an act of that kind, right? Instead of saying it would be worse if everyone did it, we're saying it would be worse if everyone was allowed to do it. Now, in that principle, you could choose not to have kids, right? So even if you're allowed not to have kids, a lot of people are going to want to do it anyway, so it wouldn't have that bad of consequences. And that works for stuff like murder and theft, right? So if everyone was allowed to do that, that would be a bad scene, right? We want to rule that out. Um, so far, so good, right? For this principle, maybe this is the way to go if you want to rule out your Sunday drive. But Sinnot Armstrong points out that for this to work, you'd have to actually let people know that they're permitted to do the thing, right? So try this. The public permission principle. I have a moral obligation not to perform an act wherever it would be worse for everyone to know that everyone is permitted to perform an act of that kind. Right? So it's not that everyone performs it, right? It's not that everyone's permitted to perform it. It's that everyone knows they're permitted to perform it. Okay. The problem now, right? So he's finally set up this is maybe the best you could do with that sort of general Kantian slash consequentialist approach. But once you get the right formulation, he says now it's got a problem. It seems to entail that, for example, it's immoral to travel on an airplane, right? So if everyone knew that everyone was permitted to fly on, right, a given airplane, the plane would be overloaded and it would crash, right? This is why we don't permit everyone to fly on airplanes. This isn't a moral issue, right? And it's analogous to the gas guzzling thing. Some otherwise morally okay activities become problematic when too many people do them, right? But that's just not a moral issue. That's just an issue of like everyday life, right? If you recall from the first lecture, the tennis example too, right? It's like, yeah, if everybody wanted to play tennis on a Sunday, then that would be a problem, but it doesn't mean it's immoral to want to play tennis, right? If everybody wanted to fly on a particular plane, that would be a problem, but it doesn't mean it's immoral to fly on a particular plane. And he wants to say that if everybody wanted to drive a gas guzzler, then yeah, that would be a problem, but it doesn't mean that it's immoral in any particular thing. It's just sort of a pragmatic problem with like, yeah, you can't. Not everybody can do everything all the time. All right. So that's it, right? So again, his strategy was to survey all these principles, say like none of them entail that your own particular act of driving an SUV is wrong, and then that's supposed to, again, it's focusing on one case, but the idea is what sort of moral obligations do I as an individual have to sort of craft my lifestyle to prevent myself from expelling greenhouse gases? And he wants to say none, right? As an individual, you don't. Government's problem. So now this is sort of a elimination of various things. He hasn't demonstratively shown that driving a gas guzzler is morally fine, right? So maybe he missed the right moral principle, right? He gave you a long list, but he didn't give you, conceivably there's other moral principles, right, that he left out or didn't think of. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's morally admirable. It doesn't mean that it isn't morally admirable to save fuel, right? That's a good thing. Um, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't raise your kids to want to save gas or even feel guilty when they waste it, right? You can still do good things that aren't moral obligations. This is called supererogatory, right? You can go above and beyond. And of course, the governments do have such an obligation, right? Even if individuals don't have these obligations, governments do. So you can take steps, right, to push your government to do these things. So maybe that, he wants to say, is the best way to spend your energy, right? Is to pressure your elected officials, your government, um, and rather than sort of just like being nasty to your neighbor who owns an SUV or like being very Spartan in your own lifestyle. He thinks that's you're not morally obligated to do it, and then maybe big picture, biggest bang for your buck is to engage in. All right, so the next lecture we'll see an argument or it's an account of how you can have these sort of group moral obligations. Uh, and you might find that attractive if you think that Sinnot Armstrong's argument lets us off a little too easy.